White bride's family were against the black groom, but then they found out this about him. The hall was filled with soft music, the steady notes of a piano weaving through the air as guests took their seats. White flowers lined the aisle, their delicate petals glowing beneath the warm light of chandeliers that hung high above. At the front, standing tall and steady, was the groom. His dark skin glowed in contrast to the ivory of his suit jacket, his posture upright but not stiff, the kind of presence that drew attention without demanding it. His eyes were fixed on the doorway where his bride would soon appear, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had always carried himself with a gentleness that people remembered long after they met him. Today was no different. Every gesture spoke of calm confidence, every breath steady, his very presence radiating kindness. He was a man deeply in love, not distracted by the grandeur around him, but anchored to the thought of the woman he was about to marry. The guests whispered softly, their voices blending with the music. His friends and family sat proudly, their eyes shining with joy and admiration. They knew the journey he had taken to reach this day, the sacrifices and determination that had shaped him into the man now waiting at the altar. Their pride was quiet but deep, filling the air with a warmth that balanced the chill of judgment from the other side of the room. The bride's family sat in neat rows near the front, their faces tight, their gazes sharp, eyes narrowed, mouths pressed into thin lines. They studied the groom as though searching for flaws. Their whispers were not kind. Some leaned toward one another, their comments veiled but pointed, glances cutting toward his suit, his posture, his very being. To them, he was not enough, never enough for the woman walking toward him. Their disapproval hung in the air like smoke, clinging to the edges of the celebration. Still, he did not falter. His eyes never wavered from the door, his smile steady, his shoulders squared with quiet dignity. He felt their judgment, of course, but he chose not to let it take root. The love he carried for his bride was stronger than their scorn. He knew who he was. He knew the life they would build together, one founded not on prejudice, but on partnership, trust, and shared dreams. As the officiant adjusted papers and cleared his throat, the music swelled softly. The guests turned their heads toward the entrance, anticipation stirring through the room. But even before she appeared, the groom's chest swelled with quiet pride. He stood at the altar, not as a man seeking approval from those who judged him, but as a man ready to honor his love, no matter the weight of the eyes that sought to diminish him. In that moment, his calm presence filled the room more powerfully than whispers ever could, a silent promise that dignity would carry him through anything that came next. The music drifted softly in the background as the last guests settled into their seats. The groom stood with quiet dignity at the altar, his eyes fixed ahead, but not everyone in the room shared the joy of the moment. A cluster of the bride's relatives leaned close to one another, their voices hushed but sharp enough to carry through the pews to anyone listening carefully. Their eyes slid over the groom's suit, tailored neatly in cream fabric, but to them it was an easy target. One aunt tilted her head, smirking, and whispered that it must have been rented, that someone like him could never afford to wear such clothing on his own. A cousin stifled a laugh, glancing at the polished shoes that gleamed under the lights, muttering that they still looked second-hand. They did not stop at what he wore. Their comments cut deeper, aimed at who he was, not just what he had chosen for the day. An older uncle leaned close to his neighbor and asked how the family could allow their daughter to marry a man like that, as if his very presence at the altar was an offense. Another relative, younger but just as cruel, shook her head slowly and whispered that the bride had always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding. Yet here she was, throwing it all away. Their words were soaked in disdain, mocking not only the man's background, but the love that had brought him to this moment. The whispers spread like smoke, weaving through the rows of families seated together. They spoke of his upbringing with dismissive tones, suggesting he could not have been raised properly. They sneered about his work, questioning what kind of career he could possibly have to match their expectations. One relative even dared to laugh softly and wonder aloud how long it would take before their daughter realized she had married beneath her. Guests nearby shifted uncomfortably, their expressions tight. A few stole glances at the groom, almost as though expecting him to hear the cruelty aimed his way. Yet he stood tall, unaware of the words but sensing the eyes that followed him with judgment. He did not falter, his face serene, his smile reserved for the moment when his bride would appear. The dignity in his stance only sharpened the contrast between his composure and the venom whispered from the rows behind. The cruelty of the bride's relatives spread like a chill through the hall. But even as they mocked him, there was a subtle unease in their laughter. They could not name it yet, but something in the calm way he stood made their words feel less certain, less powerful. And while they whispered their scorn, the truth that none of them yet knew lingered just beyond their reach, waiting to silence every sneer and every doubt. The reception hall glowed with warm light, music drifting through the air as servers carried trays of food and glasses of wine between crowded tables. The bride and groom sat side by side, their hands joined, their smiles genuine, yet even in the middle of their joy, a shadow lingered. The bride's family, seated close enough for their voices to carry, had grown bolder now that the ceremony was behind them and the hall was filled with chatter. At first, it was small comments, words slipped between laughs, but soon the whispers turned sharper, more deliberate. One relative leaned in close to another and remarked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, mocking the way the groom's voice carried when he spoke, mimicking his accent with exaggerated tones. Laughter followed, cruel and thinly veiled. Another guest at their table smirked and joked about his family, questioning whether they even belonged in such an elegant room, suggesting that they looked out of place among the crystal glasses and polished silverware. The cruelty escalated with every toast. When the groom stood to thank guests for their presence, his words warm and measured. Another relative rolled his eyes and muttered that he was trying too hard, that he spoke like someone desperate to prove himself. A few of them laughed openly, their voices loud enough to cut through the music. Some even went so far as to whisper that the only reason he was here was for status, implying that his love for the bride was nothing more than ambition wrapped in a suit. Other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman at the next table glanced down at her plate, pretending not to hear. An older man cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but his efforts were ignored. Even the servers passing by slowed, catching fragments of the mockery, their expressions tight with unease. The bride's friends exchanged glances, their smiles forced, unsure whether to speak against the cruelty or to remain silent out of respect for the family. The groom, however, never let the remarks draw him away from his dignity. He kept his composure, his hand steady on his bride's, his eyes warm when they met hers. Though he surely heard the words meant to wound him, he chose not to let them mar the day he had waited for. His silence was not weakness but restraint, a refusal to let their arrogance overshadow the love he carried. Around them, the contrast grew sharper. The family's laughter, smug and hollow, began to feel out of place in a hall filled with celebration. The bride noticed too, her lips pressed into a tight line, but the groom gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, reminding her that he would not let bitterness take hold. What the mocking relatives failed to realize was that their cruelty, so loud and public, was being witnessed by every guest present, and soon the story of their arrogance would spread just as quickly as the truth about the man they tried so hard to diminish. The groom sat at the head table with his bride's hand nestled securely in his own, the glow of the chandeliers glinting softly off the polished silver before them. The laughter and whispers of her relatives swirled like a chill through the room, pointed comments thrown with enough volume that he could not pretend not to hear. They joked about his family, his accent, even his very presence, their smiles sharp with cruelty. Yet he did not flinch. Instead, he lifted his bride's hand and brushed his thumb gently across her skin, his smile calm and unwavering. When a cousin leaned across the table to make a thinly veiled remark about his background, he answered politely, his tone even, his words respectful. He did not match insult with insult, nor did he allow bitterness to color his voice. He listened, nodded, and returned answers with the kind of courtesy that cannot be faked. Some guests nearby noticed the contrast. Where her family's remarks dripped with arrogance, his responses were measured, filled with a composure that unsettled even those who mocked him. The more they tried to provoke, the less satisfaction they found, for nothing seemed to shake him. His smile remained, not plastered or false, but steady, anchored in something far stronger than pride. His bride, sitting beside him, felt the strength of his grip and the calm that radiated from him. She had known from the moment she chose him that he carried a quiet dignity, but seeing it tested so openly only deepened her admiration. Each time she tensed at the sting of her family's words, he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, reminding her silently that their love stood taller than any sneer across the room. Even the children playing near the dance floor seemed to notice. They stopped to look at him when the laughter turned sharp, and they saw not anger in his eyes but kindness. The servers, moving between tables, caught fragments of the cruelty but watched as he answered with patience, their own respect for him quietly growing. One by one, the whispers lost their edge. The relatives who had laughed the loudest began to falter, their confidence shaken not by retaliation but by the calm resistance they faced. His refusal to be dragged into their cruelty left them staring at their wine glasses, fidgeting with their cutlery, uncertain of themselves. What had begun as mockery shifted into discomfort, their arrogance no longer carrying the power they expected. Through it all, he remained steady. He held his bride's hand as though it anchored him, his smile never dimming, his words never rising above the tone of respect. And in that hall, filled with judgment and joy in equal measure, it became clear to more than just the bride that his dignity was not something fragile. It was unshakable, and it was winning. The reception had just begun to settle into its rhythm again when the sound of engines broke through the laughter and music inside the hall. Outside, beyond the tall windows, a convoy of sleek black cars rolled up to the entrance, their polished bodies reflecting the glow of lanterns that lit the venue grounds. The hum of conversation faltered, curious heads turning toward the sudden movement. The first car door opened with deliberate grace, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. His face was instantly recognizable to many of the guests, one of the region's most successful business leaders, a figure whose name often appeared in the news for his ventures and philanthropy. Instead of walking past the crowd gathered at the entrance, he paused, his eyes finding the groom immediately. His expression lit with familiarity and warmth, and as he crossed the threshold, he greeted the groom with a firm handshake and a smile of genuine respect. The second car followed, releasing another high-profile figure, this time a dignitary known for his work in government. He too made his way straight to the groom, his voice carrying easily through the stunned quiet as he addressed him not as a stranger, but as an equal, even a friend. One by one, more figures emerged from the convoy: officials, executives, leaders of influence, all moving with purpose, all heading toward the same man who had stood quietly enduring the judgment of his new in-laws only moments earlier. The bride's family, seated together, froze in disbelief. Their whispers of scorn, their cruel remarks about his background and presence, now seemed absurd in the face of what unfolded. They had dismissed him as unworthy, yet here was undeniable proof that he was far more connected and respected than they could have imagined. Their faces drained of color as the scene grew clearer with every handshake, every word of admiration directed at the groom. The groom himself did not boast or puff his chest with pride. He received each greeting with the same calm composure that had carried him all day. His voice remained steady, his smile warm, his hand firmly clasping those of men and women whose names carried weight in every corner of the city. Where his bride's relatives had mocked him, the world outside their narrow view was now revealing the truth. He was not only deserving of respect, but already held it in abundance. Guests who had shifted uncomfortably earlier now watched with awe, their eyes flicking between the groom and the family who had tried to belittle him. The contrast was stark, undeniable. The quiet dignity he had shown in the face of cruelty was now framed by open recognition from the most influential figures in the community. The bride, her hand still in his, looked at him with new pride, her heart swelling not only for who he was in the public eye, but for how he had carried himself before the truth was revealed. The hall buzzed again, but this time it was not with whispered insults. It was with shock, admiration, and the beginning of a story that everyone present would carry long after the night was over. The hall that had moments earlier been filled with whispers of confusion and murmurs of disbelief now stood in stunned silence as the introductions continued. Each new handshake and greeting revealed another layer of truth, and the picture that formed was one no one in the bride's family had anticipated. Their mocking comments about his background, their sneers about his worth, all began to crumble beneath the undeniable respect pouring toward the groom from people whose names carried influence and power. At last, one of the visiting dignitaries raised his glass in a toast. He did not simply congratulate the couple. He spoke of the groom's accomplishments. He spoke of the companies he had built from the ground up, enterprises that had provided jobs and stability for countless families. He spoke of his investments in education, scholarships given quietly to children who might otherwise have been forgotten. He spoke of hospitals funded, shelters supported, and communities uplifted by the groom's quiet generosity. The groom had never announced these things himself, never used them as a shield against judgment, but now they stood in the open, undeniable proof of the man he truly was. Gasps rippled through the room. Guests who had only known fragments of his story leaned forward, hungry to hear more. The bride's relatives, who had once mocked his suit and whispered about his supposed ambition, now shifted in their seats, their faces drained of arrogance. Each word of praise was another mirror held up to their prejudice, showing them the folly of their assumptions. The groom himself did not swell with pride at the recognition. He bowed his head slightly, thanking those who spoke, but his demeanor remained steady, his humility intact. He did not use the moment to scold or belittle those who had mocked him. Instead, he reached for his bride's hand and held it, letting his composure tell the story louder than any words could. The bride's eyes shimmered with tears as she looked at him. She had always known his worth, had chosen him for the man he was rather than the wealth he carried, but seeing the truth revealed so openly filled her with both pride and sorrow. Pride for the man she loved, sorrow for the cruelty he had endured from her own kin. Around the hall, guests began to murmur in awe, voices carrying phrases like "I had no idea" and "he's remarkable." The staff moving between tables smiled quietly, nodding with a kind of satisfaction that dignity and kindness had triumphed. The revelation was not just about wealth or status. It was about character, about a man who had endured insults with grace, who had chosen patience over anger, and who now stood revealed as someone whose reputation extended far beyond the narrow walls of judgment. The story of the night was no longer the cruelty of the bride's family. It was the quiet, undeniable truth that the groom was not only worthy of their daughter, but worthy of the admiration of everyone in the room. The music and chatter in the reception hall had shifted. Where laughter once carried a cruel edge, now silence pressed heavily on the shoulders of the bride's family. They sat stiffly, unable to meet the groom's eyes, their faces drained of the smug expressions that had lingered all day. The very people who had mocked his accent, questioned his background, and whispered that he would never be enough now, found themselves cornered by the undeniable truth. Their arrogance had collapsed in the presence of respect so public and powerful that no denial could shield them. The guests around them exchanged glances, whispers spreading quickly between tables. They spoke not of the family's ridicule, but of the groom's restraint, of how he had endured every pointed comment without raising his voice. They remembered how he held his bride's hand, how he smiled politely even when laughter stung his ears, and how he had carried himself with a dignity that outshone the grandeur of the hall. Now, with his reputation revealed, that quiet grace was magnified, leaving every guest in awe. Children peered curiously from their seats, sensing the shift though they did not fully understand it. The bride herself, radiant in her gown, looked at her husband with eyes full of pride and love, but also with a quiet sorrow for the cruelty he had been forced to endure from her own blood. She held his hand tighter, as if to remind him that his place at her side was not given by them but chosen by her. The family silence became the loudest part of the room. No one came to their defense. Their scorn, once bold in public, had been stripped bare and left exposed. Guests would carry the memory of their arrogance, not as gossip but as a lesson. They would retell the story not with sympathy for those who mocked, but with admiration for the man who refused to be broken by it. Servers paused in their steps, stealing glances at the groom with quiet respect. The band played softly, but even the music seemed to echo the lesson that had unfolded, that wealth and power are not measured in noise or cruelty, but in dignity, patience, and grace under fire. By the time the evening wore on, the story had already begun to take on the shape of legend. Guests whispered that they had seen not just a wedding, but a revelation, the kind of moment that would be remembered long after the flowers faded and the music stopped. The groom was no longer simply the man who married their daughter. He was the man who had faced ridicule and proven, without a word of anger, that true strength never needs to shout. And so the lesson stood, etched into the memory of everyone present. Arrogance had been silenced, cruelty had been shamed, and dignity had risen above it all.